Greetings. If you are here, then you have found yourself beyond the rabbit hole. This channel is devoted to understanding current realities, future insight, via the receiving and interpretation of dreams. In this video, as a starting point, I'm going to share with you a dream I had around 2012. It was around 2010, 2012, and at the age of maybe 30 to 32 when I started to wake up to the possibility that reality, or at least the one that I was taught to believe was true, was in fact anything but true. And that there was a very real possibility that most of the worldview that I had developed at that time was based upon lies and false truths. A very smart and clever, intentional, strategic program to indoctrinate me towards some form of distorted reality. And in this way it made me passive. I was forced to be productive for the state, submissive servant of the crown. But I guess I've come a long way since those days, and I've spent nearly every day since pursuing an understanding of that false reality and a pursuit to ascend towards something greater than myself. Not only just on a physical level, but a metaphysical one too. Or if you would prefer something simpler, the material and spiritual planes of existence. So how do dreams come into all of this? Well, I've been a dreamer most of my life. Starting out at an early age with nightmares and spiders and the like, mechanical arms trying to trap me when I walk into a toilet. These progressed into sleep paralysis and night terrors. But as I grew older and I started to understand my own dominion and authority, I started to take more control over my sleeping realm. And those nightmares and terrors visited me less frequent. And so for the last 10 to 15 years, dreams have played an important role in my life. Whether in making tough decisions or grasping at internal issues I'm wrestling with, or even a warning about different relationships that I encounter. And in future videos, I'll go further in depth in the various topics related to the dream world. And by no means do I believe that I have a complete comprehension on the topic, and simply share from my experiences. So, in this first portion of the dream, I find myself standing in a crowd. Normal people like you and me, young and old, rich, poor, a sample size of humanity in all of its forms. I remember feeling soft grass under my feet and the smell of stale air, and the sense of contentment and comfortability from those around me. A certain numbness that percolated the environment. As I looked around, I realized that in fact I was in a prison, and that around me two very large, tall barbed wire fences stood. I don't know what they would have been, maybe 10, 12, 15 meters high. But internally I knew that I must escape, and that to remain for reasons unknown to me, it just would not work out well for me. And just like that, I was translated. I found myself sitting on top of the fence, looking down. Everyone I looked down upon had this passive numbness to them, like they were zombie-like, I guess, a flock of people. I guess nowadays the term has been called sheeple. It would be pretty appropriate, I guess. I remember trying to communicate to the people. I tried to communicate that we need to escape, that we need to get out of there, and that there was a certain sense of urgency to it, and that there actually was an alternative. For most of the part, people ignored me. They continued to wander around the yard in some form of drug delusion, zombie-like state, content and happy to remain within the prison. There was some that looked up though, and saw what I was doing and seemed kind of confused. Why would I ever want to leave such a comfortable place? Everything was provided for, there was limited responsibility, and it was reasonably safe. It wasn't a moment later that I found myself standing on a car. Now these transitions from one portion of the dream is not uncommon, and in some ways helps to understand that every part of the dream in its different segments represents a different aspect of understanding, a different aspect or portion of the insight that can be gleaned. And in the words of the famous Richie from Boston, I digress. And anyway, getting back to my dream. So as I find myself standing on top of this car, don't really know the make and model, or even the colour, I guess these things don't really matter. But I did see a small group of people standing around the car listening to what I was saying. As I stood there, I was communicating to them some vision that somehow I was seeing while I was communicating it. The future that I was describing, the details are, a little foggy to me now. It's been a few years, but the feeling of what I saw imprinted itself upon me. And this is often the way in dreams. You can often wake up with some almost sense of impression or impartation, and you can go for hours after you've waked up feeling like something's been deposited. So this vision that I saw of the future, the only way I could describe it would be some form of apocalyptic event that took place. I saw suffering, I saw control, I saw death, disease, pain. I saw children without mothers, crying, hungry. I saw mobs of people full of hate and anger. I saw a war beyond anything that I could think humans could do to one another. I saw the destruction of everything that as humanity we hold up as valuable, as moral. And as I came to the end of, I guess you'd call it the revealing of a not so distant future, I looked across the street from where I was standing on this car and I saw what looked like a small group of, best I could communicate would be like a black, smoky group of humanoid entities. They didn't have any very defined form, and they had a smoky wispiness about them. And they were going from one house to the next house. And as they made transitions from one house to the next house, they just totally destroyed and consumed everything from house to house. And there was a certain sense of terror that they created and a fear that was manifested around them. You know, the idea of the old Vikings raping and pillaging village to village. This was the kind of feeling that I had. And my attention was kind of pulled from that scene, and I remember turning and looking further up the street, and I saw what could only be described as these tiny little small helicopters. There were thousands of them. They were all buzzing like a bunch of bees coming down, or wasps coming down the street. And I instantly knew that this was trouble, and that I had to get out of there. Now, who would have thought that only 7 years later, we've clearly seen the rise of the drone? But again, I digress. I remember looking at the people around me, and as they were listening to what I was saying, and as our attention was being brought to these little drone helicopters that were coming our way, it felt like everyone had the same impression of doom, and that there was something coming that we just, we had to flee from. And the group started to just disperse in different directions. And all of a sudden, I remember kind of locking eyes with these two men that were in the group, that were actually there the whole time. I just never noticed them. And now all of a sudden, there was something different about these two. And I remember their eyes were more focused upon who I was and what I was doing there. And they paid a certain level of attention to me that wasn't necessarily about what I was saying, and that there was a certain nefariousness about them. In the next moment of my dream, I found myself running away with the group, and there was kind of a sense of chaos, and everyone was just kind of helter-skelter, and in that moment, I awoke. So just breaking this dream down a little bit, scene by scene. Scene 1, the sheeple. Most people are happy, and they tend to stay within something that's familiar. They tend to remain within the confines of something that's predictable, consistent, regular. This creates within mankind a sense of control. If we understand our environments, we are more likely to accept them, to come to terms with it, and even embrace it. We can even deceive ourselves into thinking that we are actually the authors of our own reality, when in fact we're actually the product of some form of programming, until we have that matrix moment. And even though I tried to communicate in the dream that there was another option, there was a sense of opposition to it. Scene 2, the fence. I'd point out too that in this dream there was a fence that I had to escape from that was a high place. In dream language, this would represent some form of obstacle that requires overcoming, and that it was lined with barbed wire, which involves some form of risk. And I think that for many people who, in their attempt to escape, the escape itself can be a challenge. And there is a natural process in which people usually go through in their transition of the stages. And if I remember the stages as something like denial, which turns into anger, which turns into bargaining with the situation, which turns into a form of depression, and finally you come to accept it as a new reality. And I think there are plenty of great videos that describe this in detail. Scene number 3, the vision of the future. Now, I'm not convinced that this particular portion of the dream has actually come to pass yet, because for as the longest time, I've actually found myself shying away from attempting to participate in the awakening process of others. I guess partly because of the constant rejection I received in my own process. And I just concluded that if the blind so embraced and loved their condition, well, then they just deserve it. And I have stayed away from being a content creator within YouTube for years. And I still don't engage in Facebook or any form of social media. I'd been trying to tell people years and years ago how destructive this was to the fabric of society, and yet no one really even listened. Scene 4, the Mad Mob. And this one I can kind of only surmise perhaps that it could be some form of biblical summoning of the entities that reside in the abyss. You know, perhaps it's a result of CERN, perhaps Manchurian Candidate, perhaps, who knows, Satanic Super Soldier, some MK Ultra project that's been rolled out in mass through trauma-based mind control and satanic ritual abuse. I suggest looking into the works of Russ Dizdar for more on this topic. But whatever it was, in my dream, it was some form of fusion between humans and something metaphysical, something evil, demonic. Some form of perversion that completely and totally consumed the possessed individual. Something that enabled the individuals to function as a collective. I remember when I first started to see ISIS make headlines, years back, and initially I thought this is what could have been in my dream. So whatever this mob represented, it was clearly destructive by nature, and to describe it simply, I would say it's the rawest form of hatred and violence. Scene 5, the Swarm.
It's flying itself. Its processor can react 100 times faster than a human. Just like any mobile device these days, it has cameras and sensors. It does facial recognition. Inside here is 3 grams of shaped explosive. This is how it works. That little bang is enough to penetrate the skull and destroy the contents.
Actually, I think this aspect of the dream is the most amazing to me, because it's the one aspect of the dream that was so accurate. And I remember even at the time, remote control helicopters and planes, they did exist, but the idea of drones wasn't really even a word. And it only took a few years later after that basically the exact replicas of what I'd seen in my dream were being sold on eBay. And to me, this is quite astounding. Actually, I think it was only last year, during the Super Bowl, that we really first saw the collective swarm of drones being used in much the same way as I had seen them in my dream. And I guess in some ways this gives me a sense of personal validation, that I'm not just a crazy nutjob with tinfoil hat. And these things were clearly weaponized. The concept of whether they were AI controlled or not was not really a concept that I knew about then, so it really wasn't something that I focused on in the dream, but they did have a sense of intelligence and the ability to work as one. And I actually believe we haven't seen the end of this particular technology. I believe that, that these drone swarms will really be the future of policing. And, even as I say that, I think about the predictive programming of shows like The Colony, in which we see the drones implemented in that sort of same way for crowd control and basic surveillance. Scene 6, the 2 men. I think this next part is a bit of a warning to me, and ever since I've kind of learnt to be a little more suspicious of whom I allow into my circle of relationships. And I won't go into this too much further because I'm not really sure if there's much we can do to remain anonymous. And let's be honest, we all know that every device has hidden optics and has incredible surveillance capabilities, and it's really not possible to hide from the mass cataloging and filing of all of our data and information. And with the 5G grid rolling out, I'm thinking that even heading off into the boonies is not going to hide you. So I suggest to be wise and careful, for not everyone is your friend. And the story of the wolf in sheep's clothing comes to mind, but that's another dream. And so if you've made it this far into the video, I hope this has been helpful. And for those of you who have remained on the fringes of the truth community, I want to encourage you that you're not a loony, you're not crazy, and that simply you are not alone.